Foreclosed, from Antab Studio and Merge Games, is an extremely visually appealing title. Just one glance at the game's visuals and you'll be immediately drawn in by its gorgeous aesthetic, its dripping neon cyberpunk visuals, and graphic novel-esque presentation style. So while the game obviously has its visual aspects nailed, does the gameplay itself deliver? Foreclosed starts off with players taking control of Evan Kapnos. He awakens in his apartment to find his employer has been bankrupt, and all access to basic necessities that he needs have been cut off. This involves the blockchain, so he can't buy anything, as well as his own apartment's rent money being severed, and even neural blocks being put in place to prevent him from leaving the city. He effectively wakes up in a dystopian governmental control nightmare. It's intensely hard-hitting, to be honest, especially given increased government control in most aspects of our lives. The game kicks off in earnest when Evan leaves his apartment to head out to a court case. Only while he's out in public, he's suddenly attacked by men in suits. Evan is able to escape, but soon discovers he's part of something much bigger, involving his former employer, SecureTech. As the story progresses, it covers some pretty typical cyberpunk and dystopian tropes, but it's also short enough not to become overbearing, and clocks in at only about 4 hours long in total. Unfortunately, when it comes to gameplay, this is where Foreclosed stumbles and falters. The game's aesthetic design of playing out like a graphic novel or a comic book with multiple pages is a unique concept that sounds amazing on paper. However, in-game this is less than ideal. The camera control and player control, as well as a severe lack of any tooltips, tutorial hints, or other information, is off-putting at first. Players will find themselves floundering in story segments, not knowing if something's an interactable object, or just end up getting stuck without any clear sense of direction. This happens frequently in the game, with a section right near the beginning almost making believe I encountered a progression bug. Thankfully this wasn't the case, but I still ended up having to read through Steam forums just to figure out how to progress. When it comes to combat, it's fairly straightforward. Players simply fire their weapons at enemies with the press of a button. You can also be stealthy if you want, sneaking around quietly and taking down enemies by frying their internal brain chips. It's a fun enough system, and since the game isn't too long, it doesn't become repetitive. When you die in Foreclosed, something that'll happen often, either through being detected by enemies or not being able to escape a chase section, the punishment is minimal, and you'll just respawn and try again. I guess it never gets too annoying because you know what to do afterwards, but this trial and error progression is going to irritate some. Sticking with the cyberpunk themes, there's also a range of upgrades you can get for Evan in Foreclosed. These are implanted chips and firmware updates that are accessed via the in-game menu. Using your upgrades, however, comes at the cost of only being able to equip 4 at a time, and only able to use them sparingly, otherwise you risk overheating yourself. When it comes to the presentation, Foreclosed mix of stealth and action sequences, coupled with the game's graphic novel presentation, becomes its downfall. With the camera angles constantly swinging around, it's hard to get to grips with the movement, and the more confusing aspects of progressing through the world become even worse. On the upside, the soundtrack in Foreclosed has plenty of synth-heavy tracks, and it suits its aesthetic perfectly. However, the voice acting sounds a bit hit and miss, and often not as convincing as it should be, especially when he starts questioning other characters as you progress in the story. Ultimately, Foreclosed is worth checking out because of its unique aesthetic and presentation style. The gameplay itself is fairly standard and straightforward, but ends up bogged down by the lack of direction and abysmal camera control during specific sections of the game. These issues build up over time and it becomes increasingly frustrating to fail to progress because of them. What sort of offsets these frustrations is the game's length and its low price. As such, it's easy enough to recommend for fans of cyberpunk games, but players who get frustrated easily should look elsewhere.